Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I want to remind you before I start that our building is open, and I hope that this program and the other Curator's Corners will encourage you to come to our galleries and see these images and objects in person. I also want to, as always, encourage you to pose any questions you have during my presentation in the Q&A box, and I'll try and do my best either to respond while I'm presenting or at the end of my time. Okay, so today, as part of our efforts to honor Black History Month, I wanted to talk about these two images, two photographs in our galleries that show African-American soldiers during World War II. And here are the captions that we include in our museum. For the photograph on the left, we say, in April 1945, an American soldier with the 7th Army was photographed after capturing a group of German soldiers in a forest. And then on the photograph on the right, as you can see, American soldiers pose in front of a crematoria at a camp in Ebense in May of 1945. Although we have those captions, the reality is we don't have much information about either of these photographs. But I think there is some important information that I can share that relates to the larger history of World War II. Let me start with what we know about the photograph on the left. The original picture is actually credited to the Associated Press, and in its archives, the caption is listed as an American soldier, there we go, an American soldier of the 12th Armored Division stands guard over a group of German soldiers captured in April 1945 in a forest at an unknown location in Germany. You may notice there are a few differences between the AP caption and the caption we have in our museum. First, the AP caption says the soldier is a member of the 12th Armored Division, while we say he was in the 7th Army. That's really not a difference because the 12th Armored Division was part of the 7th Army. A second difference is that we just say the photograph was taken in a forest, while the AP says it's taken in an unknown location, a forest in an unknown location in Germany. Again, I'd say that doesn't really make much of a difference. A third difference is that our caption says the soldier was photographed after capturing a group of German soldiers, while the AP version says the soldier is standing guard over a group of captured German soldiers. This could be read, I suppose, to say the same thing, to mean the same thing, but the AP caption is less clear about the soldiers' active involvement in capturing the Germans. I'm going to come back to this one because I think it hints at some of the larger issues that I'm going to get to in a moment. Anyway, so that's the caption from the Associated Press. They also have a few other pieces of information, including that the photograph was officially dated April 1st, not just April 1945. And second, that while the photo credit goes to the Associated Press, the photograph is listed as coming from the Office of War Information, the WWII. If the source was the Associated Press, then I'd likely think that the photograph was taken by a newspaper photographer or an AP photographer who was traveling with the 12th Armored Division. But instead, because the source is the Office of War Information, which was a somewhat controversial government office established in June of 1942 by President Roosevelt, then maybe there's a little difference here. The OWI's purpose was to centralize the many pieces of information and the information services of the US government and create a single line of communication about the war to the American public. Ooh, I see there's a question here. Let me just pull that up. Yeah, let's come back to whether he could have captured them. Yes, he certainly could have. So, but let me get back to the OWI. The OWI, the Office of War Information, was created to distribute posters, booklets, photographs, radio shows, and films about the war effort. What was controversial about these efforts is that they were designed to improve morale, boost patriotism, and encourage people to participate in the war effort. Equally important, the OWI was designed to control the information that Americans received about the war. The Office of War Information created a propaganda machine that controlled all war-related information that was going out to the public about the war. Images and news reports were censored, while government-approved ideas were included in films, radio shows, and advertising. Anything that negatively impacted the war effort or damaged morale was removed from public consumption through the actions of the Office of War Information. These same systems were the tools being used at the same time by Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels in Germany to sustain the Nazi Party's power and to rally Germans to murder millions of Jews. I should be clear that the OWI, which was under the direction of a civilian journalist named Elmer Davis, was not the same as the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. They were both based on the idea that the government could foster public support through the control of information. However, in Nazi Germany, the system operated on a different level, and the end goal was genocide, something that was never part of the American operation. At the Office of War Information in the United States, photographers were initially sent across the country to document Americans doing patriotic work. They photographed workers at factories and on farms, children gathering scrap for the war effort, men and women in uniform, everyone doing their bit. Rosie the Riveter was one of the OWI's inventions to promote the idea that women were crucial to the work on the home front. Here's another poster that the OWI created promoting the saving of scraps and recycling for the war effort. But they also promoted a positive image of African Americans with pictures like this of an African American worker in the Richmond shipyard, with the goal of encouraging everyone again to join in the effort. All of these efforts were developed out of a recognition that they were needed by the US government. There were fears that women would not be willing to do the physically hard labor to get their hands dirty for the war effort because of gender norms that had existed for generations. So the Rosie the Riveter image became one that the OWI celebrated. There were also fears that people would waste materials and goods that would be needed for the war effort. So the development of a publicity campaign to encourage that. And there were reasons to fear African Americans would not help with the war effort because through much of the country, African Americans faced segregation and discrimination and were relegated to a second-class status. This was the era still known as Jim Crow, the name of the racial caste system which operated primarily, but not exclusively, in southern states from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. Jim Crow was more than a series of rigid anti-Black laws. It was a way of life that separated Blacks and whites and projected a normalized view that African Americans were second-class citizens. Before I go on, I should warn you that I am going to show a graphic image in a minute, but one that highlights the racial attitudes of many Americans in the period in the 1930s and 40s. On the milder signs were signs like the one that you can see here, in this case from a bus station in Georgia in 1943, but others like this were seen throughout the South. Here's an example from Anniston, Alabama, where African Americans were relegated to a side entrance at a movie theater, which led to an upstairs balcony so that whites could have the main floor seating all to themselves. Or this is an example from Oklahoma City in 1939 showing a segregated water cooler. And one more example from Durham, North Carolina, where a cafe had separate entrances for white and Black patrons. But it was not only separate and unequal facilities. African Americans were also the target of intimidation, violence, and even murder. More than 100 African Americans were lynched between 1930 and 1938, grabbed by mobs of whites and hanged with no trial or due process. This is a photograph of the lynching of Thomas Shippen Abram Smith in Marion, Indiana in 1930, after a 23-year-old white man was shot and his 19-year-old fiancée claimed she had been raped by a Black man, although she later recanted. A crowd of some 10,000 people came to watch the lynching of these two men. A photograph of the incident inspired Abel Meeropol to write the poem and song Strange Fruit, which Billie Holiday recorded in 1939, 2 years before America's entry into the war. I thought I would just play a clip of her singing it, although you can see the lyrics.
Blood on the leaves southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
It is a disturbing song, and she sings it with in a particular way that I find troubling and upsetting. In the North, where there were not the same whites only signs, there certainly was still, and we know is still, racism. Lynching happened, as you can see on this map, although in far fewer numbers than in the South, but more insipid were racial covenants that restricted where African Americans could live, creating highly segregated communities and school systems, even without the legal restrictions that were imposed in the South. Regardless of the racism and segregation in America, once the war started with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, African Americans enlisted in the war effort. In 1941, fewer than 4,000 African Americans were serving in the military, and only 12 African Americans had become officers. When the draft was initiated after Pearl Harbor, more than 2.5 million African Americans registered. And by 1945, more than 1.2 million African Americans were serving in uniform on the home front, in Europe, or in the Pacific. However, African Americans joined a military that, much like America, was segregated. This meant that most African Americans serving at the beginning of World War II were assigned to non-combat units and relegated to service duties such as supply, maintenance, or transportation. Stephen Ambrose, the great World War II historian, identified the lamentable irony that the world's greatest democracy fought the world's greatest racist with a segregated army. That irony was something that African Americans noticed well before Stephen Ambrose. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, on February 7th of 1942, the most widely read Black newspaper in America, the Pittsburgh Courier, launched a national campaign that urged Black people to give their all for the war effort, while at the same time calling on the government to do all it could to make the language of the constitutional amendments guaranteeing equality real for every citizen, regardless of race. In the search for victory overseas and at home, they called it the WWII campaign, adopting this logo that soon spread to other African-American papers across the country. The WWII campaign had its roots in a letter to the editor written by James Thompson of Wichita, Kansas, that the Pittsburgh Courier published in January of 1942. Thompson wrote, "Being an American of dark complexion and some 26 years, these questions flashed through my mind. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? Will America be a true and pure democracy after this war? Will colored Americans suffer still the indignities that have been heaped upon them in the past? These and other questions need answering." The legacy of the WWII campaign is hard to measure. By the end of the war, although the Pittsburgh Courier could not claim any concrete accomplishments from the WWII campaign, it had provided a voice to Americans who wanted to protest racial discrimination and contribute to the war effort. And 3 years later, on July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which ordered the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces, finally achieving one of the main goals of the WWII campaign and realizing what it had fought for. Truman's decision followed not only the WWII campaign, but also demonstrated achievements by African-American soldiers during the war. By the final year of the war of World War II, troop losses had virtually forced the military to begin placing more African-American troops into positions as infantrymen, pilots, tankers, medics, and officers in increasing numbers. In October of 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion became the first African-American tank squad to see combat in World War II, October of 1944. They were assigned to the hard-charging Third Army under the command of General George Patton. Patton apparently welcomed them with colorful language that he was known for, saying, "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." Vintage Patton. By the end of the war, the Black Panthers, as they had become known, had fought their way further east than nearly every other unit from the United States, receiving 391 decorations for heroism. They fought in France and Belgium and were one of the first American battalions to meet the Russian army in Austria. They also broke through the Nazis' Siegfried Line, allowing all of Patton's Third Army to enter Germany. But it wasn't just the 761st Black Panthers. As the war progressed, some military units began to integrate, including the soldier seen in our photograph. His 12th Armored Division was one of the 10 US divisions that had integrated combat companies. 10 divisions out of about 60 that fought in the European theater, not a really great number, but it was a start. And this takes me back to the fact that the original source for our photograph was the Office of War Information. The photograph is not an action shot, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem like a completely staged shot. I'd say it's somewhere in between. Both the American and German soldier seem well aware of the camera and are looking towards it. It looks like it was taken on purpose, not just randomly. The content, combined with the fact that it was taken by the Office of War Information, makes me think that it was likely taken to help rally support for African Americans, both in other divisions and back home. I should emphasize that that is just my supposition. The fact is we don't have the details about this. I can say, however, that there are hundreds of thousands of photographs showing African American soldiers from World War II. Most show the troops on parade or in training when it was far easier to get photographs. There are also many that show the camaraderie of military units. Far rarer, however, are photographs like ours that show African American soldiers confronting the enemy, again, because the segregated military largely kept African American soldiers in non-combat roles. And here I want to go back to the caption provided by the Office of War Information. Something I didn't mention before, but I do think is notable, is that the caption does not label the soldier as African American. It just says an American soldier. There is recognition of equality with that phrasing, appropriately earned by African Americans who had risked their lives in the same way as white soldiers. Like Patton had said, the color of his skin didn't matter. He was a soldier. However, the OWI's description of the soldier as only guarding the soldiers, the Nazis, rather than having actively engaged in capturing them, hints back to the racist views of the time. And here again, I should be clear, I'm leaning on my own supposition because we don't have the details, but I think of the prevalence of racism in America and the fact that even in 1945, after 4 years of African Americans proving their commitment to the war effort, the military still resisted integration and continued to relegate most Black soldiers to menial positions. While the OWI wanted to highlight the active service of Black soldiers, they did not want to upset racist Americans by celebrating African Americans moving into frontline duties. So by labeling this soldier as just serving as a guard, the OWI could try to walk that fine line of rallying African Americans, but not riling up racist whites. There are clues, however, that the soldier here is more than just a guard. First, he's wearing combat fatigues that look well worn. It's not the uniform of a soldier who's relegated to a rear echelon. There is no clear sign of insignia or rank. Again, something that was much more likely among the frontline fighters than those in service roles. And he has the full gear of a fighting soldier, from the bayonet and Remington rifle to an ammunition belt and over-the-shoulder bag that is just visible on his back. His uniform and gear suggest that he was more than just a guard. But again, that might have been seen as something many white Americans were not ready to hear in 1945. Let me turn now to the other photograph we have of African American soldiers, which is actually a far less well-known image. The As I mentioned, by 1945, African-American soldiers were serving in combat capacities. And as frontline fighters, they also were among the troops that liberated some of the Nazi concentration camps, which is captured in this image. The full photograph actually shows 5 African-American soldiers who are standing in front of the crematoria at Obense after its liberation. Obense was a subcamp of Mauthausen, one, as you can see here, of about 100 subcamps. It was opened in 1943 to house prisoners who worked as slave laborers, building enormous tunnels that housed armament works and storage that was protected from Allied bombing. Altogether, almost 28,000 men were sent to work at Obense, more than 1/3 of whom died there. The conditions were always atrocious, with starvation diets, the rampant spread of disease, and hard physical labor. But as Allied forces closed in on Nazi territories in the early part of 1945, prisoners from other camps were sent towards and to Obense. And as the population rose at Obense, the supplies of food were inadequate and the conditions deteriorated further. By May of 1945, half of all the prisoners at Obense were categorized by the Nazis as ill with one disease or another. In the final months of the war, the crematoria at Obense was unable to keep up with the high death rate, leading to the creation of mass graves and the piling up of bodies around the camp. As the Allies approached on May 5th, 1945, most of the Nazi guards fled. Liberation officially came on the following day, May 6th, when American troops from the U.S. 80th Infantry Division, part of Patton's Third Army, arrived. The soldiers found prisoners who were starving and barely clothed. I don't know if these African-American soldiers were part of the 80th Infantry Division. The only clue in the photograph is the patch worn by one of the men in the middle of the photo. It's hard to see clearly, and it may be the patch of the U.S. Third Army. It also could be the patch of the 44th Infantry Division of the National Guard that pushed into Austria in May of 1945 and established their command post in Imst, only about 200 miles west of Obense. But in all honesty, I don't think the patch looks like either of those, but I haven't been able to identify it. If any of you recognize the patch on this soldier's arm, I really would be grateful if you'd reach out to me. We do know that members of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, participated in the liberation of Gunskirchen, another subcamp of Mauthausen, 3 days before the liberation of Obense. It is possible that some members of that unit traveled south and were part of the liberation of Obense on May 6th, or went to see the camp as part of Eisenhower's effort to make sure that US soldiers learned about the barbarism of Nazi concentration camps. But as I say, I haven't been able to identify what unit these men were in. Whether or not this group of soldiers helped liberate Gunskirchen or Obense, we do know other African-American soldiers certainly did. And here let me share a poem written by one of the survivors who was liberated from the main camp of Mauthausen, Sonia Weitz, who tried to describe her liberation experience in a poem. The title of the poem is Black Messiah. And you can see it reads, "A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah. A black Messiah came for me. He stared with eyes that didn't see. He never heard a single word which hung absurd upon my tongue. And then he simply froze in place, the shock, the horror on his face. He didn't weep, he didn't cry, but deep within his gentle eyes, a flood of devastating pain, his innocence forever slain." The poem serves as a reminder about the many roles played by African-American soldiers during World War II. It certainly would be possible that the soldiers shown in our photographs were liberators like the one described by Sonia, but we don't know for sure. We don't have the names of these soldiers or much detail about them. But even that little information that we do have is a window into the much larger history of the actions of African Americans during World War II. And I will stop there. Before I look at some of the rest of your questions, let me just highlight a couple of our other upcoming programs. Tomorrow night, we are hosting a program with Beverly Eddy, the author of a new book called Richie Boy Secrets, about the immigrants and refugees who had the language skills, along with the broader cultural knowledge, that became particularly valuable to the US war effort during World War II. They were recruited for special military intelligence training and went to Camp Ritchie in Northern Maryland before being sent on to Europe and the Pacific, helping the US win the war. There has been a lot of attention recently about Camp Ritchie, and I hope you'll join us for this presentation from the author of the most recent scholarship about this important group of soldiers. I will be back for my next Curator's Corner next Wednesday on March 2nd to speak about a wedding dress in our collection that was used in a wedding in Amsterdam just a few days before the Nazis invaded in 1940 and was later brought to America by the bride and groom, and provides a window into the Holocaust in the Netherlands. And one more program to mention, on Tuesday, March 8th, we'll be holding the next program in our 2G Tuesday series, where we provide a forum for the children of Holocaust survivors to share their parents' stories. On March 8th, Meryl Minaj will be talking about her father-in-law and a couple of other family members who escaped from Salonika, Greece, one of the most important centers of Sephardic Jewish life before World War II. I'll add that she's going to be sharing a particular family connection to Michel Asael, whose Auschwitz symphonic poem will debut at Carnegie Hall in a performance on April 10th that you can also buy tickets to from our website. You can find more details about these and all our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org and click on the events tab. I hope you'll also click the Give Now button and make a donation to support our programs. Okay, let me see. I know I missed a bunch of questions. Let me get back to them. So would the soldier have had bullets in his rifle? For sure, for sure. As I said, there were by 1944 combat soldiers, African-American combat soldiers. There seems to be a helmet and suspenders on another guard soldier in the back of the group. And it seems to me that given the disregard for Nazis or blacks, it was deliberate to have a black soldier guarding them in a higher position. Absolutely, Felice. I think, well, for a photo, it might have been a way to emphasize the racial views of the Nazis, but that was always a fine line because of the issues in America. But certainly for the Nazis who were captured, they probably would have struggled with the fact that they were being caught by an African-American soldier. Somebody mentions that there is a survivor who was rescued by one of the soldiers at Abense, currently residing in Greensboro, North Carolina. That's great. What response was given to the African-American soldiers when they returned to the US? Did they get positive recognition for their contributions? Famously after World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters had this big parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. I think there was not a singular demonstration like that after World War II, but there's no question that the fact that African Americans had fought for the US effort, it fed into the civil rights campaign and was recognized by many as a reason why they should be given equal rights. I mean, it just was part of it. It was actually, I mean, it wasn't unique to just after World War II, but that's certainly an impact of it. Was the OWI successful in rallying support from the Black community for the war effort? I'm not sure if it was just the OWI, Frank. The fact is, but we had wide support in America from the African-American community, even with the Double V campaign. That Double V campaign was not saying to African-Americans, don't support the war effort. The Double V campaign said, support the war effort and urge the government to do more. So I'd say, yes, the OWI was successful in that regard. A few other comments I see. What is the black container that the soldier is holding? That's in this photo on the right. That is a canister of the Zyklon B, I think. That's what the canisters look like. I don't know for sure because it's not labeled, but I believe that's what's that canister. Okay, well, Thanks very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you at some of our other programs soon. Take care. Bye-bye.